The night my daughter told me to pack my things and leave her house, she didn't shout or slam a single door. She stood across the kitchen island with her arms folded and said it the way someone comments on the weather. "Mum, I think it's time you find somewhere else to stay. Tonight." For a moment I honestly believed I had misheard her, because no child says that to the woman who carried her for 9 months. I looked around the kitchen as if someone else might explain the joke. The dishwasher hummed softly behind me, and the smell of lemon soap still clung to my hands. Mark was in the living room pretending not to listen, but his shoulders were tight and unmoving. My daughter avoided my eyes like I was a stranger asking for money. The word tonight echoed louder than anything else she had said. Not next week, not after a conversation, not when things improved. I asked her calmly if something had happened, because I could not understand how we had arrived at this moment without warning. She sighed in a way that made me feel like I had already exhausted her patience. "It's just not working anymore," she said, like I was a subscription she forgot to cancel. I searched her face for the little girl who once clung to my leg on her first day of school. I wondered if I had been blind to signs of resentment growing quietly between us. 3 months earlier, she had insisted I move in after I sold my home to cover unexpected medical bills. She told me it would only be temporary and that families help each other in hard seasons. I had hesitated because I did not want to disturb her new marriage. She reassured me that I would never be in the way. Now she stood there acting as if I had overstayed a welcome that was never truly offered. Mark finally cleared his throat and said they needed their space back, and I realized this conversation had been rehearsed before I entered the room. I thought about the mornings I woke before sunrise so I would not use the bathroom while they were getting ready for work. I remembered paying for groceries with my pension check and pretending I had a coupon so they would not feel uncomfortable. I had folded their laundry and cleaned their counters because sitting still made me feel guilty. I tried to make myself useful in small, invisible ways. Yet somehow my presence had become heavy in their carefully arranged life. My daughter said she felt like she could not relax in her own home. I wanted to ask her if she remembered how I never relaxed while raising her alone after her father died. Instead, I kept my voice steady and asked where she expected me to go on such short notice. She suggested a motel, as casually as recommending a restaurant. The suggestion settled into my chest like cold air, and I realized she had already decided that my discomfort was acceptable collateral damage. I looked at the refrigerator covered in photos, including one from her college graduation where I was crying with pride. I had worked 2 jobs and sold my wedding ring to help pay her tuition. I never told her how many nights I skipped dinner so she could attend summer programs with her friends. All those sacrifices had felt natural at the time, because love does not keep score. But standing in that kitchen, I felt the imbalance like a weight pressing down on my spine. She said she could not put her marriage second anymore, as if my survival required her to choose sides. I wanted to remind her that I never asked to come live with them. She had insisted with tears in her eyes and promises in her voice. Now she seemed eager to rewrite that memory. I realized arguing would only make me look desperate. So I nodded slowly and told her that if this was what she truly wanted, I would respect her decision. She looked surprised by my calmness, as if she had prepared for a dramatic scene. I walked down the hallway to the guest room that had become my temporary world. The bed was neatly made because I always kept it that way, even though no one else ever entered the room. My suitcase sat beneath the frame, still dusty from the last move. As I pulled it out, I noticed my hands were steady, which startled me more than anything else. I began folding my clothes with deliberate care, smoothing each fabric like it deserved dignity, even if I did not. In the living room, I could hear the soft murmur of their conversation, low and relieved. They were not grieving this moment the way I was. That realization hurt more than the words themselves. I understood then that I had already been erased from the center of their life. As I packed, memories rose uninvited and vivid, refusing to stay buried in the past. I saw her at 8 years old with a fever, curled against my chest while I stayed awake all night counting her breaths. I remembered sitting in bleachers at her soccer games with a thermos of cheap coffee because over time shifts left me exhausted. I recalled teaching her how to balance a checkbook, telling her that independence was the greatest gift she could give herself. Every lesson I taught her was meant to strengthen her, not distance her from me. I had raised her to build a life where she would never feel trapped or dependent. Perhaps I had succeeded too well. She had learned how to survive without me, but somewhere along the way she decided she did not want me near her either. I zipped the suitcase closed and paused for a long moment. Something inside me shifted quietly from pleading to clarity. If I walked out tonight, I would not return the same woman. When I rolled my suitcase back down the hallway, neither of them moved to help me, and that small detail settled something hard inside my chest. My daughter stood by the door with her arms wrapped around herself, not crying, not angry, just resolved. Mark remained on the couch, his eyes fixed on the television screen that wasn't even turned on. The silence in that room felt heavier than any argument we could have had. I placed my hand on the doorknob and looked at her one last time, hoping for hesitation, for a flicker of doubt, for the smallest crack in her certainty. Instead, she gave me a tight nod, like a manager approving a request form. I realized then that this wasn't an emotional decision for her anymore. It was logistical. Outside, the evening air was cooler than I expected, and the sky had already begun fading into indigo. I stood on the porch for a moment, unsure where to direct my feet, because when you leave without a destination, every direction feels equally foreign. I had not booked a motel room because part of me believed she would reconsider before it reached this point. My savings were thin, carefully stretched across medication and insurance premiums. Pride told me not to ask anyone else for help, especially not friends who thought I was safely settled with my daughter. I did not want to become a cautionary story whispered over coffee, so I did what I have always done when life cornered me. I inhaled slowly, straightened my back, and chose motion over fear. The motel I found was 3 miles away, a low building with flickering lights and faded curtains visible from the parking lot. The woman at the front desk did not ask many questions, and I was grateful for that mercy. I paid for 3 nights in advance, telling myself it was only temporary. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant, and the bedspread had a pattern that tried too hard to look cheerful. I set my suitcase on the dresser and sat down carefully on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked beneath my weight, reminding me that even furniture protested when something unfamiliar pressed against it. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for tears to come. They did not. Instead, memories arrived in steady waves, each one carrying a contrast too sharp to ignore. I remembered the first apartment I rented after my husband died, how I painted the walls myself to save money. I remembered assembling second-hand furniture while my daughter napped on a blanket nearby. Back then, struggle felt like a shared challenge between us, not a private burden. We had faced hardship side by side, even when she was too young to understand it. Now I was facing displacement alone while she returned to a home filled with warm light and curated comfort. The contrast was not lost on me. I had built safety for her so thoroughly that she no longer recognized what insecurity felt like. Perhaps that was my greatest success and my deepest wound. I reached for my phone around 9 o'clock, half expecting to see a missed call from her. There was nothing, no message asking if I arrived safely, no text explaining that emotions had run high and maybe we should talk tomorrow. The silence felt deliberate. I realized she likely believed this distance would restore balance to her life. She would wake up in the morning, sip coffee in a quieter kitchen, and convince herself that she had done what was necessary. Meanwhile, I was calculating how many nights I could afford in a room with stained carpet and thin walls. I wondered if she imagined any of that. I wondered if she allowed herself to. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the hum of the air conditioner and footsteps passing outside. Each time I woke, I had to remind myself where I was. The unfamiliar ceiling above me felt like a reminder that stability is never permanent. Around 3 in the morning, I sat up and turned on the small lamp beside the bed. I opened my suitcase and pulled out the folder where I kept copies of important documents, bank statements, insurance forms, the deed from the house I had sold. I had walked away from that house thinking I was trading independence for family closeness. Now I saw the transaction more clearly. I had given up ownership in exchange for temporary belonging, and temporary things I was learning expire without notice. The next morning, I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse that made me feel composed rather than displaced. I did not want to look like someone who had been asked to leave in the middle of the night. Appearances matter, especially when dignity feels fragile. I drove to a nearby diner and ordered coffee and toast, pretending this was simply a short getaway. As I sat by the window, I began listing practical options in a small notebook: extended stay facilities, senior apartments, sublets. I refused to let humiliation cloud my thinking. If I had survived widowhood, debt, and illness, I could survive this too. But survival was no longer my only goal. Something inside me was beginning to ask for more than endurance. By the afternoon of the second day, I had toured 2 small apartments, both overpriced and dimly lit. The leasing agent spoke to me with polite indifference, as if I were just another application number. I noticed how easily the world categorizes older women as quiet, manageable, unthreatening. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit that expectation. Standing in those cramped spaces, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not anger exactly, but awakening. My daughter believed removing me would restore her comfort. What she did not understand was that displacement sometimes creates clarity. When you are stripped of familiarity, you begin to see patterns you ignored before, and I was starting to see mine. That evening, I checked my bank balance again and calculated how long I could maintain this arrangement. It was not sustainable beyond a few weeks without drastic changes. I could feel the pressure building, not as panic, but as decision. I would not beg my daughter to reconsider. I would not plead for a corner in her carefully curated life. If she wanted space, I would give her more space than she ever anticipated, but I would not disappear quietly into inconvenience. As I turned off the lamp and lay back against the thin pillow, a thought settled into place with surprising calm. Sometimes being told to leave is not rejection, sometimes it is redirection. The third morning in the motel brought a clarity I hadn't expected, the kind that comes when solitude stretches long enough to strip away pretense. I brewed coffee in the tiny kitchenette, the smell strong and oddly comforting, as if I had reclaimed a small portion of control. I reviewed my notes again, folding them neatly into categories: immediate options, medium-term plans, long-term security. The notebook felt heavier in my hands than it should have, weighted with potential rather than panic. I realized that for the first time in years I was planning entirely for myself, not anyone else. The thought should have felt selfish, but instead it felt righteous, like breathing after a week of being submerged. Memories of my daughter's words echoed faintly in my mind. Tonight, Mom. Each repetition now seemed less like punishment and more like a spark, igniting a resolve I had buried beneath years of obedience. I glanced out the window at the parking lot below, noting a single car pulling away, and I understood in that moment how small movements can signify change. The room, modest and slightly musty, suddenly felt like a headquarters, a command post for the life I was about to reclaim. After breakfast, I called my lawyer, Monica, a woman I had trusted for more than a decade. She answered on the first ring, surprised but attentive. I explained everything in measured sentences, avoiding the tremor I felt creeping into my voice. I told her that I had been asked to leave my daughter's home and that I wanted to know my rights immediately, because years of caregiving and financial independence had taught me that legal clarity is power. Monica did not interrupt. She let me speak and then began laying out a plan that made my pulse steady with anticipation. There was a way to protect my assets, a way to secure a place that was fully mine, and a way to assert boundaries without drama. I listened closely, scribbling notes in the margins of my notebook, aware that this was the first conversation in a long while where my voice carried weight. By the time I hung up, the room felt different, as if walls were no longer constricting me but giving space to expand. I took a deep breath and felt something I had not felt in months: clarity, edged with possibility. That afternoon, I returned to the parking lot outside my daughter's house, not to confront, not to plead, but to observe. I sat in my car, a quiet observer in neutral territory, and watched the front door. The curtains moved behind the living room windows, shadows of activity within, and I realized how long I had allowed myself to be erased from their lives. I did not envy them, though. I felt a detached curiosity, a recognition that life's unfairness can teach lessons if you pay attention. While they carried on comfortably, believing I was inconsequential, I was preparing the groundwork for a future where my dignity could not be questioned. I jotted down notes on logistics, distances to essential stores, potential friends nearby, and possible community centers. I began forming a mental map of independence, one street at a time. In that quiet observation, I recognized the duality of my situation. My daughter had tried to erase me, but I had gained insight that she could never force me to ignore. By evening, I drove back to the motel, notebook full and heart lighter. Sleep came easier that night. For the first time, I allowed my thoughts to wander beyond immediate survival. I imagined rooms filled with my belongings, spaces arranged exactly how I wanted, and the quiet satisfaction of being fully in charge of my own schedule. I envisioned mornings where I could stretch in peace, afternoons spent reading or painting, evenings with music that no one criticized. The idea of being wholly accountable to no one was intoxicating, like inhaling air after being underwater too long. In those hours, I understood a profound truth. Being told to leave does not always signify failure. Sometimes it is the universe granting you permission to grow beyond imposed limits. My daughter had seen my presence as a weight, but I saw the same moment as liberation in disguise. I drifted into sleep thinking of plans, of spaces, of a life where no one else's comfort dictated my worth. The motel, modest and impersonal, had become a crucible for transformation. The next morning, I drove to a local community centre, the kind that offered senior programming and social events. I walked inside with an air of quiet determination, not seeking pity, not seeking approval, only information and connection. The receptionist smiled politely as I asked about long-term housing programs, transportation options, and volunteer opportunities. I listened attentively as she outlined available resources, jotting down names and contact numbers. The staff seemed practiced in helping women like me, and their calm professionalism reminded me that the world contained allies even when family did not. I left the centre with a folder of pamphlets, a map of resources, and an unexpected lift in my step. Each interaction reinforced the idea that being displaced had awakened a kind of resilience I had forgotten I possessed. I drove back through the neighborhood, observing streets I had once ignored, realizing how many paths I had taken for granted. The sense of possibility was growing steadily, like a river building momentum. By afternoon, I began exploring rental listings online, carefully noting neighborhoods that were quiet, affordable, and safe. I wanted a place where I could breathe without feeling observed, where my routines would not trigger resentment. Each listing was accompanied by photos, which I scrutinized not for glamour, but for practicality. I noted layouts that would accommodate my needs, kitchens that allowed for cooking without strain, and natural light that would make mornings bearable. It was methodical work, almost meditative, and it reminded me how much control had been ceded in previous years. I realized that careful observation, patience, and deliberate action could compensate for a lifetime of misplaced trust. By evening, I had 3 solid options, each with pros and cons meticulously listed. I folded the paper carefully into my folder, feeling the satisfaction of preparation rather than panic. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of ownership not just over my possessions, but over the trajectory of my life. That night, I reflected on the journey from the kitchen confrontation to this point. The contrast was startling. Once I had been asked to leave in a hasty moment, now I was planning an entire chapter of independence with deliberation. I understood how displacement can sharpen perspective and clarify priorities. I thought about the years of caregiving, sacrifice, and love, and how those years had been misinterpreted by the very people I had sought to protect. Yet, in that realization, there was no bitterness, only focus. I had been given a choice between being a victim and being strategic. I had chosen the latter, The motel room, once a symbol of rejection, had become a space of empowerment. And with empowerment came clarity, a recognition that actions taken today could shape a life of dignity tomorrow. The following morning, I woke before sunrise, the sky pale and promising, and I felt a surge of energy that surprised me. I brewed coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, and sat by the window watching the world slowly awaken. The thought of facing another day of planning no longer felt daunting, it felt necessary. I reviewed the notes I had taken over the past few days, each one a small brick in the foundation of my new independence. I had outlined immediate housing options, contacted agencies, and even mapped out nearby grocery stores, banks, and medical facilities. The discipline of planning restored a sense of power that had been absent since my daughter had told me to leave. I realized that this was more than logistics. It was reclaiming control over my life, something I had taken for granted until now. I felt a quiet pride in my meticulous preparation, the kind that comes from knowing that every step is deliberate and thoughtful. For the first time, my future felt like something I could shape, not a series of reactions to other people's whims. After breakfast, I decided to visit one of the potential rental units in person. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with old trees and tidy lawns, and it reminded me of the kind of stability I craved. I walked into the small apartment, noting the sunlight streaming through the windows and the quiet hum of the heating system. The unit was modest but well maintained, and I could already imagine arranging my belongings, hanging photos, and setting up a small space for painting. I asked questions about utilities, parking, and neighbors, and the manager answered with a warm, professional tone that contrasted sharply with the cold reception I had felt at my daughter's home. Walking through the apartment, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years, a realization that safety and respect could be restored, even in a small space. By the time I left, I knew this could be the place where I would reclaim my sense of self. Back in my car, I called Monica again, sharing the details of the apartment and asking her to check the lease terms for anything that might compromise my rights. Monica reminded me that thoroughness was key. The more prepared I was, the less chance there would be for manipulation. She encouraged me to keep documentation of every conversation and every transaction, advice that felt familiar yet vital. I took notes, feeling empowered rather than overwhelmed, and promised myself that every step I took would be informed and deliberate. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of partnership with someone who understood both the law and my personal circumstances. By evening, I had a clearer picture of my next move: secure housing, document everything, and maintain a careful distance from the drama I had been forced into. That afternoon, I walked through a nearby park, the sunlight falling in patches through the trees. I observed families, couples, and individuals passing by, and I thought about my own family history, the sacrifices I had made, and the misunderstandings that had led to this confrontation with my daughter. I felt no anger toward strangers, only a reflective sense of what life had taught me. Resilience is built in quiet moments, often unseen by the people who cause us pain. I took notes in my notebook about potential support groups, community events, and local contacts, realizing that social connection would be crucial for maintaining independence. It wasn't just about finding a home, it was about reclaiming a life, one that included safety, dignity, and fulfillment. Every step I took reinforced that this was not just survival, but transformation. Later, I returned to the motel room and began organizing my belongings. I sorted through clothes, personal items, and keepsakes, carefully deciding what would come with me to the new apartment and what could be stored or discarded. Each item I touched brought a memory, some bittersweet, some comforting, but all part of the story I had lived. I realized that packing was not simply a logistical task, it was symbolic. By choosing what to bring and what to leave behind, I was consciously shaping the life I wanted to inhabit, separate from the constraints imposed by my daughter. This sense of agency was invigorating, a reminder that autonomy can be reclaimed even after years of compromise. By nightfall, I had packed several boxes, ready for the next stage of the journey. The next morning, I arranged a meeting with a local bank to ensure that my finances were secure and accessible. I explained my situation to the bank manager, providing documentation and instructions for account management that protected me from potential interference. The manager listened carefully and helped set up safeguards that gave me confidence in my ability to control my money independently. I left the bank feeling lighter, knowing that my financial foundation was protected, a vital step in reclaiming autonomy. The thought that I could now manage both my home and my resources without interference was liberating. Each action built momentum, reinforcing the sense that I was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's decisions. Afterward, I met with a real estate agent to discuss possible properties that aligned with my budget and lifestyle. We toured several houses, each presenting different opportunities and challenges. I asked detailed questions about neighborhood safety, accessibility, and potential renovations. The agent was patient and professional, offering insights that I noted carefully in my notebook. I realized that being deliberate and informed was empowering. Every question I asked, every detail I considered, was a reaffirmation of control I had lost for too long. By the end of the day, I had a short list of potential homes, each representing a tangible step toward independence. The process, though tiring, was exhilarating. It reminded me that action, no matter how measured, always moves the needle forward. In the evening, I returned to the motel and reflected on the progress I had made. The contrast between this careful, proactive planning and the chaos of being told to leave by my daughter was stark. Whereas before, I had been reactive, scrambling to maintain dignity in an environment controlled by someone else, now I was proactive, taking deliberate steps toward a future that belonged to me. I reviewed my notebook, made additional notes, and refined my plan for moving. The sense of clarity was profound. I realized that independence is cultivated through both careful thought and intentional action. By nightfall, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than fear, knowing that each step brought me closer to reclaiming not only a home but also a sense of self-respect. Late at night, I sat by the window, sipping tea and watching the quiet streets outside. I thought about the life I had built for others and how much of it had gone unacknowledged, but I also recognized that my strength had never faded, it had simply been overlooked. Now, in this moment, I understood that being asked to leave did not diminish my worth. It had simply created an opportunity to assert boundaries, reclaim authority, and demonstrate that my life could be fully mine, without compromise. The quiet night, the empty streets, and the steady rhythm of my breathing were affirmations of the control I had regained. I felt a sense of satisfaction that was deep and enduring, the kind that comes from knowing that resilience is cultivated, not given. The next morning, I woke early again, feeling a determination that had become almost a constant companion. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma filling the small motel room, and sat at the table reviewing my notebook. Each entry reminded me of the steps I had already taken: financial safeguards, housing options, community connections. Today, however, I needed to focus on the legal side, ensuring that my daughter could not interfere with my independence again. I called Monica Reeves first thing, her calm, measured voice immediately putting me at ease. I outlined my concerns about potential challenges with moving, property rights, and any attempts at interference, and she assured me that with documentation and clear procedures, we could prevent any surprises. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing I had an ally who understood both the law and the stakes. For the first time, I felt truly secure in my planning, and the anxiety that had haunted me since my daughter's ultimatum was replaced by a quiet confidence. After the call, I drafted letters to several contacts, including neighbors, local authorities, and community organizations. I wanted to ensure that everyone involved in my transition understood the situation and my rights. Writing each letter carefully, I included key facts, dates, and names, presenting the truth in a clear, organized manner. This process, though tedious, felt empowering. It was a way to assert control and prevent misunderstandings. I recognized that proactive communication could protect me and prevent unnecessary conflicts during the move. By mid-morning, I had finished the letters, neatly folded and ready for mailing, each one a small shield against potential interference. The act of writing, of clarifying my position, gave me a renewed sense of purpose and reminded me that preparation is often the strongest form of protection. Later, I visited the new apartment again, this time with a moving checklist in hand. I measured spaces, visualized furniture placement, and took detailed notes on storage solutions. The unit felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a home I could claim as my own. I imagined arranging photographs, hanging curtains, and creating small corners for reading and painting. Each step reinforced the idea that this was not just about leaving my daughter's house, it was about creating a life that belonged entirely to me. I spoke with the building manager about delivery schedules and accessibility options, ensuring that the move would be smooth and without unnecessary complications. With every detail addressed, I felt the anxiety that had accompanied my departure start to fade, replaced by anticipation and a sense of freedom. Back at the motel, I began organizing my belongings with renewed vigor. I sorted clothing, personal items, and keepsakes, carefully deciding what would travel with me and what could be stored or given away. Each item I touched brought memories, some tender, some painful, but all part of the narrative that had led to this moment. Packing became a symbolic act of reclaiming my autonomy, a way to assert that my life, my choices, and my space were mine alone. I labeled boxes clearly, noting fragile items, priority items, and things that required special attention. The process, though laborious, was deeply satisfying, a reminder that preparation is power, and each step I completed strengthened my sense of independence. By evening, the room was filled with neatly stacked boxes, each representing a piece of the life I was taking back. The following day, I scheduled an appointment with a local moving company. I explained the situation discreetly, emphasizing the importance of punctuality and professionalism. The company assigned a team who understood the need for efficiency and care, and they arrived early the next morning, ready to assist. I directed the packing and loading, ensuring that fragile items were handled with care and that essential belongings were accessible. Watching my possessions leave the motel and enter the moving truck, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and liberation. This was more than a physical move, it was a metaphorical one, a transition from a space defined by conflict to one defined by choice and autonomy. The movers worked efficiently, and by late afternoon, everything was en route to the new apartment. Once the boxes were unloaded, I began arranging my new home. I placed furniture, hung curtains, and set up a small corner for painting and journaling. Each adjustment was deliberate, reflecting my taste, comfort, and priorities. I added personal touches, a small vase of fresh flowers, framed photographs of friends and family, and a well-worn armchair that had always been my reading spot. The apartment felt alive, infused with my presence and intentions. I realized that creating a home is not just about walls and furniture, but about the atmosphere and energy one cultivates. This space was mine, free from judgment or intrusion, and I could finally breathe without the tension that had shadowed my every move for the past weeks. In the evening, I prepared my first dinner in the new apartment. The kitchen was small but functional, and as I chopped vegetables and stirred a simmering pot, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Cooking for myself felt empowering, a daily reminder that I was capable, independent, and fully in charge of my life. I set the table with care, lit a small candle, and sat down to eat alone but not lonely. The quiet was restorative, a contrast to the constant tension I had endured in my daughter's house. Each bite of food reinforced a sense of normalcy and stability, and I realized that reclaiming my home also meant reclaiming the simple pleasures of life that had been overshadowed by conflict. The next morning, I explored the neighborhood, walking along quiet streets lined with trees and small parks. I greeted neighbors, noticing the friendly smiles and casual conversations that made the area feel welcoming. I identified nearby shops, a pharmacy, and a small grocery store, imagining routines that would integrate me into the community. These small discoveries, mundane to some, were milestones for me, each step affirming my independence and ability to navigate life on my own terms. The contrast between this freedom and the confinement imposed by my daughter was striking, and I felt a deep gratitude for the opportunity to create a life defined by choice rather than obligation. That afternoon, I met with a local senior center coordinator to discuss community programs and social opportunities. I expressed interest in art classes, book clubs, and volunteer work, emphasizing the importance of engagement and connection. The coordinator provided brochures and detailed explanations, and I felt a spark of excitement about forming new friendships and rediscovering my passions. The realization that my life could be filled with creativity, social interaction, and purpose without interference from my daughter was invigorating. I left with a sense of possibility, imagining days filled with learning, laughter, and meaningful activity, all within a supportive community that respected my independence. By evening, I returned to the apartment and reflected on the progress I had made. Each task completed, each decision made, reinforced a growing sense of empowerment and self-determination. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat in my favorite chair, and reviewed my notebook, noting accomplishments and future steps. The quiet comfort of my surroundings, the control I had established over my space and schedule, and the clear path forward created a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. I realized that moving out had been more than a physical act. It was a declaration of autonomy and a reclaiming of dignity that no one could take away. I smiled to myself, feeling a profound connection to the life I was actively shaping. The following morning, I woke with a sense of anticipation, feeling that today marked the beginning of establishing routines that would define my new life. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, letting the rich aroma fill the apartment, and settled at the small table near the window. Outside, the sunlight spilled across the street, illuminating the trees and gardens that would become familiar sights over time. I opened my notebook and began outlining a schedule for the week: grocery trips, appointments, personal projects, and moments for reflection. Each item I planned was intentional, a way to structure my life on my own terms rather than reactively responding to someone else's rules. This deliberate approach gave me a sense of control I had not felt in years, a reassurance that I could navigate daily life with confidence and grace. The clarity of planning eased my mind, replacing residual anxiety from the weeks of upheaval with a quiet determination. After reviewing my schedule, I prepared a simple breakfast and sat to eat while observing my surroundings. The apartment felt warm, welcoming, and unmistakably mine. I noticed the details I had chosen intentionally: the small framed photographs, the potted plants on the windowsill, the neatly arranged books on the shelf. These elements, small as they might seem, were powerful reminders that I was creating a life of my own making. I felt gratitude for having a space where my choices mattered, where the influence of my daughter's judgment no longer loomed. Each bite of breakfast reinforced my autonomy, and I realized that reclaiming my life was not just about leaving the past behind, but actively crafting a present that reflected my values and desires. The peacefulness of the morning contrasted sharply with the tension I had endured, reinforcing my resolve to embrace this freedom fully. Later, I ventured out to explore the local grocery store, armed with a list and a plan. Walking through the aisles, I felt a sense of liberation, making choices about what to buy without fear of criticism or interference. I carefully selected fresh vegetables, fruits, and staples for the week, paying attention to meals that would nourish both body and spirit. Each decision was deliberate, a small act of self-care and independence. At the checkout, I interacted with the cashier politely, engaging in a brief conversation about the weather and neighborhood, feeling the simple joy of human connection without the tension of obligation. The experience, mundane to some, was empowering to me, reinforcing that everyday choices could be moments of reclaiming agency and dignity. Upon returning home, I unpacked the groceries methodically, arranging the kitchen in a way that made cooking and meal prep intuitive and enjoyable. I noticed the contrast between this space and the chaotic, tension-filled environment of my daughter's house. Here, everything had a purpose, a place, and a sense of order that reflected my approach to life. I prepared a light lunch, savoring each bite, appreciating both the flavors and the autonomy I exercised in selecting and preparing the meal. Cooking had become a form of meditation, a way to connect with my body and mind while affirming my independence. The act of feeding myself, carefully and intentionally, symbolized the broader reclamation of control over my life and choices. In the afternoon, I took out my painting supplies, eager to reconnect with a creative practice I had long neglected. Setting up my easel by the window, I allowed the natural light to illuminate the canvas, feeling the familiar excitement of starting a new piece. The act of painting became a conduit for reflection, each brushstroke a mixture of emotion, memory, and intention. I worked slowly, deliberately, allowing the colors to blend naturally, creating shapes and forms that felt both expressive and cathartic. The process reminded me of my resilience and creativity, qualities that had persisted despite years of familial tension and challenges. By the time I stepped back to observe the nearly finished painting, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and connection to my own identity, reaffirming that this space and this life were truly mine to shape. Later that day, I made a point to call an old friend I had lost touch with over the years. We spoke for nearly an hour, reminiscing about shared memories and updating each other on our lives. The conversation was warm, filled with laughter and the occasional tear, and I realized how much I had missed genuine connection. Re-establishing these bonds felt like restoring a piece of myself that had been suppressed during the long period of conflict with my daughter. It reminded me that relationships could be nurturing and positive rather than draining or conditional. By the time we said our goodbyes, I felt a renewed sense of social engagement and support, knowing that my life could be enriched not only by independence but also by meaningful connections with others. In the evening, I decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood to observe the community and meet more neighbors. I greeted people politely, engaged in small talk, and felt the warmth of a community that seemed welcoming and supportive. I noticed families walking together, children playing, and older adults enjoying the sunshine. These scenes reinforced my belief that this neighborhood offered not just a residence, but a potential network of support and companionship. The contrast between the warmth of these interactions and the tension I had experienced with my daughter highlighted the value of choosing one's environment carefully. Each friendly exchange became a small affirmation of the life I was building, one based on respect, independence, and shared humanity. Returning home, I reflected on the day's accomplishments, realizing how much progress I had made in establishing routines and creating a sense of normalcy. I prepared a simple dinner and set the table with care, enjoying the quiet and comfort of my new space. The apartment, once unfamiliar, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could rest, recharge, and continue shaping my life without interference. I spent the evening journaling, documenting both practical tasks and emotional reflections, reinforcing the connection between action and introspection. Writing allowed me to process the past while focusing on the future, ensuring that each decision and experience contributed to a cohesive, intentional life. Before bed, I prepared for the next day by reviewing my plans and setting intentions. I thought about upcoming appointments, creative projects, and social interactions, envisioning each moment as an opportunity to reinforce independence and well-being. The act of planning provided a sense of security, knowing that I could navigate challenges with foresight and preparedness. I reflected on the contrast between the fear and uncertainty I had endured and the empowerment I now felt, recognizing that reclaiming my life was both a physical and emotional journey. The sense of control, clarity, and purpose I cultivated each day became a foundation for resilience and confidence, ensuring that I could thrive in this new chapter of life. As I turned off the lights, I sat quietly in the stillness of my apartment, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. The space, once filled with uncertainty and transition, now radiated comfort, autonomy, and possibility. I felt gratitude for the freedom I had fought to reclaim and for the opportunity to define my life on my own terms. The challenges ahead would inevitably arise, but I faced them with the knowledge that I had both the resources and the resilience to navigate them successfully. As sleep approached, I reflected on the journey thus far, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and anticipation for the days to come, knowing that each moment was an affirmation of my independence and personal agency. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden patterns across the floor, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose as I stretched and breathed deeply. I made my way to the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and took a moment to enjoy the rich aroma before settling at the table. Opening my notebook, I reviewed the week's schedule, noting appointments, personal projects, and moments I had carved out for reflection. Each task represented a small victory, a deliberate step toward reclaiming the life I had been denied for so long. I allowed myself to savor the feeling of autonomy, a stark contrast to the tension and judgment that had once dominated my daily existence. Planning in this way gave me confidence, reminding me that I was capable of steering my own life, making decisions that reflected my needs, desires, and priorities. The clarity of thought this routine provided was grounding, reinforcing the stability I was building. After breakfast, I decided to tackle a project I had been postponing, reorganizing the small bookshelf that sat in the corner of the living room. Pulling each book off the shelves, I dusted and rearranged them according to both subject and personal significance. Some were novels that had comforted me during difficult times, others were cookbooks and guides for crafts I wanted to explore. As I worked, I reflected on the symbolism of the task. Arranging my books was akin to arranging my life, giving each experience, memory, and interest its proper place. The process felt meditative, reinforcing my sense of order and control. I realized that reclaiming my life wasn't solely about freedom from my daughter's judgment, but also about creating spaces and routines that nourished my mind, body, and spirit in meaningful ways. Each item returned to its rightful place, strengthened the sense that I belonged here, that this was my home, and that I was capable of creating a life that felt safe, nurturing, and whole. Mid-morning, I set out for a walk to explore the surrounding neighborhood further. I greeted neighbors as I passed, offering smiles and polite conversation, and felt the warmth of community that had previously seemed distant. I noticed the small gardens, the careful maintenance of lawns, and the little details people added to make their homes welcoming. Observing these elements, I felt inspired to bring similar touches into my own living space, reinforcing the sense of identity and care I wanted to cultivate. Walking also allowed me to process my thoughts, each step acting as a rhythm that carried me forward emotionally as well as physically. The contrast between this peaceful, autonomous routine and the tension-filled interactions with my daughter became increasingly evident, highlighting the relief and satisfaction that came from making choices without fear or criticism. The exercise, both literal and mental, gave me clarity and renewed energy for the day ahead. Returning home, I prepared a light lunch, enjoying the process of selecting ingredients, chopping vegetables, and combining flavors in ways that suited my taste and dietary needs. Cooking had become more than a necessity, it was a form of creative expression and self-care. I relished the quiet independence of the act, feeling a sense of pride in nourishing myself with intention and care. Each bite of the meal reinforced that I was capable of caring for myself, creating a life rooted in comfort, health, and personal satisfaction. Eating slowly, savoring both flavors and textures, I reflected on the contrast between this nourishing experience and the neglect and misunderstanding I had faced in the past. Meals, once fraught with tension and expectation, had transformed into rituals of empowerment, affirming that I could thrive when allowed to act on my own behalf. In the early afternoon, I sat with my painting supplies once again, determined to finish the canvas I had started days before. Each brushstroke was deliberate, capturing emotion and memory in ways words sometimes failed to convey. I allowed the colors to flow organically, blending shades that reflected both my inner turmoil and my growing sense of peace. Painting became a therapeutic practice, providing an outlet for reflection, processing, and expression. The act of creation reminded me that I was capable of generating beauty, even in the aftermath of betrayal and upheaval. Completing the piece, I stepped back and admired the finished work, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and connection to my identity. The process reinforced that independence was not just about physical space, but also about reclaiming the creative, emotional, and intellectual aspects of myself that had been suppressed. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. The conversation was warm and filled with mutual curiosity about each other's lives, offering both laughter and moments of emotional depth. Reconnecting with family outside the immediate circle reminded me that not all relationships were conditioned by judgment or neglect. There were bonds that could be nurturing, supportive, and affirming, counterbalancing the difficult experiences I had endured. Sharing stories and hearing updates about loved ones reintroduced a sense of belonging and connection that had been absent for years. By the time we ended the call, I felt uplifted and encouraged, reminded that life could be enriched by relationships built on respect, care, and genuine interest in one another's well-being. As evening approached, I prepared a simple dinner and set the table carefully, appreciating the quiet solitude and the ability to organize my environment as I pleased. I reflected on the day's events, noting both tangible accomplishments and internal growth. Each task, interaction, and moment of reflection contributed to a sense of coherence and purpose, reinforcing the feeling that I was creating a life that was fully my own. Writing in my journal afterward, I recorded both practical details and emotional reflections, weaving them into a narrative of autonomy, resilience, and intentionality. Journaling allowed me to track progress, release lingering anxieties, and reaffirm my commitment to living deliberately, providing a sense of continuity and structure that bolstered my confidence and well-being. After journaling, I decided to call a friend I had promised to meet for coffee the next day. Coordinating plans and catching up reminded me of the joy of connection and the value of cultivating relationships that nourished rather than drained. I felt excitement at the prospect of seeing someone who understood and appreciated me, and I recognized the contrast between supportive friendships and the conditional, often manipulative relationships I had left behind. Planning this simple social interaction reinforced the idea that I could choose the people in my life deliberately, surrounding myself with warmth, kindness, and respect. The anticipation of the visit added a sense of lightness and joy to the evening, balancing the work of establishing independence with the pleasures of shared experience. Before bed, I spent time tidying the apartment, ensuring that everything was in its place and that the environment reflected calm, order, and intentionality. I noticed the details I had implemented, the neat arrangement of books, the carefully chosen decorative accents, and the small plants that added life to the space. Each element contributed to the sense that I was creating a sanctuary, a home where I could thrive without interference or judgment. Sitting in quiet reflection afterward, I felt gratitude for the steps I had taken, the independence I had claimed, and the resilience that had carried me through the past weeks. The peace I experienced was hard-earned, but it was profound, reinforcing the value of intentional living and self-advocacy. As I finally turned off the lights, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Each day of careful planning, creative work, social connection, and self-care was a building block in a life reclaimed from neglect and misunderstanding. The apartment, once unfamiliar, now felt like a true home, a reflection of my choices, values, and intentions. I acknowledged both the challenges I had faced and the victories I had achieved, understanding that resilience was built not only through confrontation, but also through deliberate, thoughtful action. With sleep approaching, I felt a deep sense of calm and accomplishment, ready to face the next day with confidence, clarity, and a renewed commitment to living fully and authentically. The morning sun spilled through the blinds, warming the small kitchen as I prepared breakfast, savoring the quiet moments that had become a new rhythm in my life. I took my time with the coffee, inhaling its aroma, and set out a plate of toast and fruit, feeling the satisfaction of caring for myself on my own terms. The calm was a sharp contrast to the tension and chaos I had left behind, where even the simplest routines were interrupted by judgment and disapproval. Sitting at the table, I opened my notebook to jot down thoughts, ideas, and reminders for the day, keeping a clear record of my intentions and plans. Writing had become more than a habit. It was a tool for clarity, helping me process emotions and maintain a sense of direction. I reflected on the journey so far, noting the resilience that had carried me through betrayal, disappointment, and neglect, and marveled at the quiet strength I had cultivated. Each small choice reinforced the growing sense of autonomy and purpose, and I felt proud of the life I was shaping for myself. After breakfast, I decided to tackle the garden, a space that had begun to feel like an extension of my home and my spirit. Pulling weeds and tending to the plants, I felt grounded and connected to the earth beneath my feet, each action a reminder that I could nurture life and beauty with patience and care. The garden had become a sanctuary, a place where I could reflect on the past while creating something tangible and vibrant for the future. As I pruned branches and watered seedlings, I thought about the symbolic meaning of these small acts: growth, renewal, and persistence even after hardship. The physical exertion was satisfying, reinforcing a sense of accomplishment that complemented the emotional and mental progress I had been making. I paused often to appreciate blooms, the gentle sway of leaves, and the way sunlight danced across petals, each detail a quiet affirmation of life's resilience and my own. By mid-morning, I took a walk around the block to enjoy fresh air and a change of scenery, greeting neighbors along the way. The friendly exchanges and smiles reminded me that connection could be simple, genuine, and restorative, unlike the strained relationships I had left behind. Observing others' routines and the care they took with their surroundings, I felt inspired to incorporate more intentional touches into my own living space, reinforcing the sense that this home reflected both my personality and my values. Walking allowed me to process thoughts and emotions, each step offering a rhythm that calmed the mind and clarified priorities. The contrast between this peace and the earlier tension in my life was stark, highlighting how autonomy and deliberate action could transform daily experiences into moments of empowerment. With each step, I felt more rooted in the life I was building and more confident in my ability to maintain boundaries, create joy, and assert my needs. Returning home, I decided to prepare a light lunch, choosing ingredients that were fresh, nourishing, and suited to my taste. Cooking had become both a necessity and a creative outlet, an opportunity to assert independence and enjoy the simple pleasures of preparing food exactly as I wanted. I savored the process of chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and tasting along the way, finding comfort in the act of creating something solely for myself. Each meal reinforced the idea that I could care for my own well-being, a practice that extended beyond nourishment to mental and emotional health. The contrast between this quiet, intentional activity and the control and judgment I had experienced before was striking, reinforcing the value of creating routines that honored my choices and respected my independence. Eating slowly, I reflected on how far I had come and how much control I had reclaimed over my life, savoring both the flavors and the freedom they symbolized. In the early afternoon, I returned to my painting project, determined to finish a canvas that had been waiting for days. With each brushstroke, I expressed emotions that words alone could not capture, allowing color and form to convey layers of experience, reflection, and resilience. Painting had become a therapeutic outlet, a way to process challenges and articulate personal growth through creativity. The act of creating reminded me that I was not defined by betrayal, neglect, or loss, but by my ability to transform adversity into something tangible and meaningful. Completing the painting brought a sense of satisfaction and pride, reinforcing my identity as someone capable of cultivating beauty and order in both art and life. The canvas stood as a testament to the autonomy I had fought to reclaim and the inner strength that guided my daily choices, each stroke a marker of perseverance, clarity, and deliberate intention. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a distant cousin I had not spoken to in years, and the conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with warmth, laughter, and shared memories. Reconnecting reminded me that not all relationships were fraught with judgment or disappointment, that there were connections rooted in genuine care and respect. Listening to their stories and sharing my own reinforced the idea that life could offer joy and belonging, even outside the immediate circle that had once caused pain. By the time the call ended, I felt uplifted, reminded that building supportive connections was possible and deeply enriching. This interaction also highlighted the contrast between nurturing relationships and those that drained energy, showing me the value of surrounding myself with people who contributed positively to my life. I took mental notes of these interactions, planning future calls and visits, grateful for the reassurance that connection and companionship were still within reach. As evening approached, I prepared a simple dinner and set the table with care, appreciating the calm solitude of my home. I reflected on the day's activities, noting the achievements, creative efforts, and small acts of self-care that collectively strengthened my sense of autonomy. Each choice, from gardening to cooking to painting, contributed to a coherent rhythm, reinforcing the control I had reclaimed and the independence I was cultivating. Writing in my journal afterward, I captured both practical details and emotional reflections, weaving them into a narrative of resilience, intentionality, and growth. The act of journaling allowed me to consolidate experiences, release tension, and document progress, providing a lasting record of my journey towards self-sufficiency, empowerment, and emotional recovery. After journaling, I reached out to a friend to confirm plans for a morning coffee meeting, feeling excitement and anticipation at the prospect of reconnecting in person. Coordinating this social interaction reminded me that relationships could be nourishing, supportive, and fulfilling when chosen deliberately. The simple act of scheduling a visit and looking forward to it reinforced the contrast between this positive engagement and the strained interactions that had dominated my past. I felt a lightness in anticipation, a sense of joy that accompanied the thought of sharing time with someone who valued and appreciated me, reinforcing my understanding of what healthy, supportive connections looked like. This preparation became a bridge between the routines of self-care and the pleasures of social connection, reinforcing balance in my daily life. Before bed, I spent time tidying my home, ensuring that everything reflected order, intention, and care. The small gestures, arranging books, straightening cushions, watering plants, served as tangible reminders of the life I was actively shaping. Sitting quietly afterward, I reflected on the day's accomplishments and the sense of peace that accompanied intentional living. The environment I had curated, both physically and emotionally, represented my autonomy, resilience, and commitment to self-determination. I felt gratitude for the clarity, control, and creative expression that had become part of my daily routine, understanding that these small but consistent actions were key to maintaining long-term emotional and psychological stability. As I settled into bed, I allowed my mind to wander through the day's experiences, reflecting on the growth, choices, and triumphs that had filled each hour. Every step, from nurturing my garden to reconnecting with family, contributed to a sense of coherence, purpose, and self-respect. I acknowledged both challenges overcome and progress made, understanding that reclaiming my life was a gradual, deliberate process rooted in intentional choices. With a deep sense of satisfaction, I closed my eyes, feeling gratitude, empowerment, and the quiet confidence of a life lived on my own terms, ready to embrace the next day with focus, creativity, and emotional clarity. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the soft grey light filtering through the curtains, and felt a sense of anticipation mixed with calm determination. I dressed slowly, savoring the ritual of choosing clothes that made me feel comfortable, confident, and entirely in control of my appearance. The house was quiet, the hum of early morning traffic distant, and I took a moment to appreciate the stillness, knowing how rare peace had been in my previous life. Walking into the kitchen, I started a pot of coffee, enjoying the familiar aroma as it spread warmth through the room. I prepared a light breakfast, mindful of each bite, knowing that self-care was more than indulgence. It was an assertion of my independence and the respect I owed myself. Sitting by the window, I observed the neighborhood coming to life, children heading to school, neighbors walking dogs, and the occasional car rumbling down the street, all ordinary moments that now felt precious. This normalcy was a sharp contrast to the turbulence I had endured, a reminder of how much power there was in reclaiming daily routines for oneself. After breakfast, I turned my attention to paperwork, going over bills, insurance, and account statements with meticulous care, making sure everything was organized and accurate. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I reconciled balances, checked due dates, and noted upcoming appointments, each action reinforcing that my life was governed by my decisions alone. Unlike before, when others controlled or manipulated finances, I now held complete authority, and the contrast was both liberating and affirming. Completing this task, I set aside a folder of important documents in a dedicated drawer, a symbolic gesture of control and preparedness. I paused to journal briefly, reflecting on the relief of handling responsibilities without interference and appreciating the clarity and empowerment this brought. Each organized document, each careful note, was a building block in the structure of a life restored and fortified against intrusion or manipulation. Mid-morning, I decided to visit the local library, a place that had always held a sense of calm and inspiration for me. Walking through the aisles, the smell of books and polished wood filled my senses, and I felt a quiet joy in the abundance of knowledge and stories surrounding me. I selected a few novels and biographies, knowing that reading would feed both my curiosity and my emotional resilience. Sitting in a sunlit corner, I opened the first book and allowed myself to be absorbed in another world, letting words wash over me, offering both escape and perspective. The experience reminded me that learning, reflection, and imagination were tools for growth, and that self-enrichment could be pursued freely without judgment or restriction. Observing other readers, young and old, I felt a sense of belonging in a community united by curiosity and respect for knowledge, a stark contrast to the isolation and control I had experienced in the past. Returning home, I decided to spend time in the garden again, tending to roses that were now flourishing under my care. I pruned, watered, and arranged blooms, appreciating both the aesthetic and symbolic value of each flower. Gardening was no longer just an activity. It had become a metaphor for the life I was cultivating, rooted in patience, resilience, and deliberate action. I reflected on how I had nurtured relationships, boundaries, and personal strength, much like I nurtured these plants, understanding that growth required attention, consistency, and love. While working, I noticed the sunlight shifting across the yard, illuminating petals in gold and red, and I felt a profound sense of satisfaction in the tangible beauty I had created. Each plant, each arrangement was a quiet declaration of autonomy, a signal that life could be vibrant and self-directed even after betrayal and upheaval. In the early afternoon, I decided to make a video journal entry, capturing my thoughts and reflections on recent events and progress. Speaking aloud, I recounted my feelings, milestones, and insights, knowing that articulating them helped reinforce my clarity and resolve. I shared observations about personal growth, the importance of boundaries, and the joy of reclaiming control over everyday choices, framing my experiences as lessons both for myself and for anyone who might face similar challenges. The act of recording my story felt empowering, a way to preserve memory and wisdom while asserting agency over how my narrative was told. Each sentence, each pause was deliberate, demonstrating that communication could be both expressive and disciplined, reflecting a life governed by intention rather than reaction. Later, I prepared a light lunch, this time experimenting with a new recipe that I had been wanting to try, enjoying the process of creation and the satisfaction of results. Cooking became both an art and a practice of mindfulness, each ingredient chosen carefully and each technique executed with focus. I reflected on how these small acts of autonomy, choosing recipes, timing meals, tasting and adjusting, were acts of empowerment that reinforced my independence. Eating slowly, I appreciated the flavors, textures, and the freedom to make these choices without external interference or critique. These ordinary acts, once taken for granted, had become symbolic milestones of my journey towards self-determination and emotional restoration. By mid-afternoon, I took a quiet moment to meditate, sitting in my favorite chair with eyes closed, focusing on breath and presence. The meditation brought a sense of centeredness, helping to release tension, reinforce gratitude, and deepen my awareness of the progress I had made. I reflected on the contrast between the chaos and control I had endured in the past and the peace and clarity I now experienced, appreciating that emotional stability was a skill cultivated through deliberate practice. As thoughts arose, I acknowledged them without attachment, reinforcing a mindset that was both resilient and flexible, capable of facing challenges without reverting to fear or reactivity. The practice left me calm, refreshed, and ready to engage with the remainder of the day with purpose and patience. As evening approached, I began preparations for dinner, choosing to make a comfort meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, savoring the tactile, sensory process of cooking. I set the table with care, lighting a small candle to add warmth and intention to the meal, appreciating the simple joys that were now fully mine to create and enjoy. Eating, I reflected on the day's accomplishments, the autonomy exercised in each choice, and the resilience displayed in maintaining my life and boundaries. I acknowledged the contrast between this calm, intentional routine and the chaos that had previously dominated my interactions, appreciating the richness of a life rebuilt on self-determination and deliberate action. After dinner, I spent time reviewing letters and emails, responding selectively and thoughtfully to correspondence that mattered, further asserting control over my communication and personal interactions. The act of prioritizing responses reinforced the importance of maintaining boundaries, engaging only with those who contributed positively to my life. I felt gratitude for this autonomy, understanding that every choice, no matter how small, reinforced the larger framework of independence and self-respect I had been cultivating. By the time I finished, the house was quiet, orderly, and filled with a sense of intentionality that radiated through every space. Before bed, I revisited my notebook, jotting down reflections from the day and mapping out goals for the week ahead. Writing allowed me to consolidate thoughts, track progress, and articulate desires, reinforcing a narrative of personal growth, autonomy, and resilience. Closing the notebook, I felt a deep satisfaction in the continuity of my life, each day building upon the last in deliberate, meaningful ways. I lay down with a sense of calm and purpose, ready to embrace tomorrow with clarity, confidence, and the quiet power that came from living fully on my own terms.